And with many of us who have been associated with the center, residents at the center affiliates and fellows, with a luncheon, followed by a period of sort of reminiscences by people who had lived at the center. We then had a delightful Bharatanatyam dance presentation prior to this. We've been transformed from a dance stage to a panel discussion table. And the day then proceeds with this panel discussion. And after the panel discussion, there will be a reception across the street at the Center for the Study of World Religions, to which you are all invited, and please do come. And at the reception, there will be a celebration of the publication of the history of the center, the publication of the book on the history of the center, or the history of the CSWR, authored by John Carman and Kit Dodgson, called Community and Colloquy. So there will be a book signing. We will celebrate that book. But it will be just a time to talk, to interact, to converse, and to be together. So please, after the panel, do join us across the street. As you know, this panel discussion is called the, quote, Sympathetic Study of World Religions, Peril and Promise. And you may have wondered, well, why sympathetic and why put that in scare quotes? And it's put in scare quotes because it really is language that comes from the original deed of gift, which established the Center for the Study of World Religions. So the donors use that language, the sympathetic study of world religion. And it raises perhaps a number of different kinds of questions in regard to the teaching of world religions in a university context like Harvard. What sort of critical perspectives does one bring to that? What is the relationship between such issues as the practice of religion, for example, and the study of religion? They're all different kinds of questions that language was meant to evoke. So some of those issues will be addressed by the panel today. Without further ado, let me then make a few brief introductory comments about each of the panelists and about George Rupp, the moderator of the panel. And then we will simply proceed ad seriatim, one after the other, and there will be time for questions and discussion after the panelists then speak. So the moderator of the panel is George Rupp. George Rupp became president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee in 2002 after serving as president of Columbia University for 9 years. Prior to that, he served as president of Rice University for 8 years. Professor Rupp's long association with the Center for the Study of World Religions really dates back to the time he was a PhD student here at Harvard, and then the O'Brien Professor of Divinity and the Dean of Harvard Divinity School. Under George's leadership, the curriculum was revised to reflect the increasing diversity of religion studies at Harvard Divinity School. George and his wife Nancy lived at the center in 1967 and then again in 1973-77 before moving next door at Jewett House, where he lived as dean from 79 to 85. He's the author of numerous articles and several books. Most recently, Columbia University Press in this year published Globalization, Challenged, Conviction, Conflict, and Community. Our speakers then begin with Vasudha Narayanan. She's Distinguished Professor in the Department of Religion at the University of Florida and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Hindu Traditions there. She's also the past president of the American Academy of Religion. Professor Narayanan holds the PhD from the University of Bombay in India and studied at Harvard from 1975 to 1977. And during that time, she was in residence at the CSWR. Her research focuses on Hindu traditions in India, Cambodia, and America. Again, published numerous articles and books, including the Vernacular Veda, The Way and Goal, Expressions of Devotion and Early Sri Vaishnava Tradition, which was published jointly with the CSWR and the Institute for Vaishnava Studies. I mention that because, in fact, it is on sale at the HDS bookstore. David Eckel is the Associate Professor of Religion and the Director of the Institute for Philosophy and Religion at Boston University. David's research focuses on the Indian Buddhist philosophical traditions, especially the Madhyamika, including the monographs Understanding Buddhism, Jnana Garbha's commentary on the distinction between the two truths, and To See the Buddha, a Philosopher's Quest for the Meaning of Emptiness. His edited volume, India and the West, The Problem of Understanding and Selected Essays of J.L. Mehta, was published by the CSWR and is also available at the HDS bookstore. David's association with the CSWR began as a PhD student. He lived at the center in the mid-70s and later served as assistant director, then administrative director, and also briefly as acting director. Lamin Sanneh is the D. Willis James Professor of Missions and World Christianity at Yale University. He is an editor-at-large of the Christian Century, and he's on the editorial boards of several academic journals. He's also on the board of Ethics and Public Policy here at Harvard. For his academic work, Professor Sanneh was awarded Senegal's highest national honor, the Commander of the National Order of the Lion. Two of his recent monographs include the much-reviewed books, Whose Religion is Christianity? The Gospel Beyond the West, and Abolitionists Abroad, American Blacks and the Making of Modern West Africa. Professor Sanneh's affiliation with the CSWR dates from the time that he was a professor at Harvard in the 1980s before he moved to Yale. Jane Smith is professor of Islamic Studies and co-director of the Macdonald Center for Christian-Muslim Relations at Hartford Seminary. Prior to that, she was vice president and dean of Iliff School of Theology in Colorado. She teaches and writes on women in Islam, Muslim communities in America, and historical and theological relations between Christians and Muslims. Professor Smith is the co-editor of the Muslim World. She's the area editor for Brill's Encyclopedia of Women in Islamic Cultures and a member of the Commission on Interfaith Relations of the National Council of Churches. Her recent publications include Muslim Women in America, The Challenge of Islamic Identity, and Becoming American, Immigration and Religious Life in the United States. Jane was affiliated with the Center in the 70s, including as assistant director when she was an associate professor here at Harvard. The CSWR published her translation from the Arabic of The Precious Peril, which is also available at the HDS bookstore. These panelists are very distinguished, as you can see from these very brief introductions. They could have gone on for many more minutes. But I want to flag particularly their relationship with the Center and how important the Center for the Study of World Religions has been in terms of the study and teaching of world religions. So welcome. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce George Rupp and the panelists to you.
Well, thank you, Don. That takes care of most of what I would otherwise have to do as moderator. So I'm very grateful. Welcome, all of you. This is a celebration of the Center and of the publication of Community and Colloquy, which we do hope you'll all come over to the reception afterwards so that you can congratulate John Carman and Kit Dodgson on the publication of that. You'll notice the dates are 1958 to 2003. And I wondered, in my own mind, 45 years, that's kind of an odd number to have as an occasion for a volume. And then I realized that it probably was calling attention to the fact that the Center is across the street from 45 Francis Avenue. But I'm not sure that's the whole motivation. In any case, welcome to this celebration, both of the Center and in the publication of that book. Please turn off your cell phones. Don mentioned the intentions of the donors, and we hear a good bit about what their intentions were. I thought it would be worth taking just a minute to read their own in their own language what it is that they wanted the Center to accomplish. This is from the Deed of Gift. This contribution is given to the Divinity School of Harvard University as an endowment. The income to be used in any way which will further the, as Don has just told us, the sympathetic study of the religions of the world. The donors do not look upon these funds as support for traditional comparative studies of religions with their critical evaluations of other faiths from the point of view of humanism, traditional Christianity, or any other preconceived systematic analysis. They recognize that such evaluations of religions other than one's own are inevitable, but believe that the first responsibility is to present these religions sympathetically, as seen by the believers in each faith. The tools of analysis should be those of scholarly integrity and sympathetic spiritual insight, and the same for all religions, including one's own. The intentions of the donors are not syncretistic nor eclectic. It is the firm conviction of the donors that an understanding of the spiritual insights of devout men of other faiths will challenge students to a deeper appreciation of the spiritual insights of their own faith, and will enable them to see that the revelation of the varying religions has been an ascending cycle. Just to show that they weren't altogether free of presuppositions, they had to include that last phrase. Well, in any case, that's what the sympathetic study of religion as the donors to the center intended, and we now have the great good fortune to hear from 4 of our colleagues, all of whom, as Don made clear, have been associated with the center over a great many years, and will tell us how this intention, in fact, has become embodied in the global community that the center constitutes. You may wonder why you're going to hear from the speakers in the order in which Don introduced them, and it seemed to me, seeing no other reasonable way to decide, I would just ask them to speak in the order of the venerability or the age of the traditions that are their primary focus of inquiry. So,
well, I thought it was my age.
I was feeling so young.
So we start with you, Vasudha.
I caught my breath for a minute. Good afternoon and namaste. It's a pleasure to be here. Actually, it's more than a pleasure. I'm just so happy to be here and see old friends. I've been on such a state of high all afternoon that it's hard to get back to discussing real things. It seemed perfectly natural to be invited to talk about, quote, the sympathetic.
A specialist in Hinduism of all people should know that we're not now talking about real things.
It seemed perfectly natural to speak about the sympathetic study of religion, because the first mantra, in fact, it was veritably a bija or a seed mantra that I heard when I first came to the center in 1975 was the word epoche. In this version of phenomenology of religion, the interpretive commentary was straightforward. One spoke about a tradition from the viewpoint of the believer, and one did not criticize the other tradition. Do I have it right after all these years? This was the first class I had with Professor Carman. Christensen, Vandeleo, and more immediately Wilfred Cantwell Smith and John Carman were part of our lineage of teachers, our Guru Parampara. Among the many changes that have taken place in the last 25 years in the teaching of religion in many schools around the country is the overwhelming emphasis on theory and method, even in undergraduate classes. Some say we're just catching up with the rest of the humanities, and many of us are working with socio-scientific methods as well. Another major change, and that's speaking from my perspective, is that our writings are being now read by people of whom we write about. In the case of Hindu traditions, Hindus and non-Hindus, academics and non-academics, people in India as well as in the diaspora are reading about what is being written about them and responding. And it's in this context that I'd like to address my remarks today. So we have at least 3 variables here: homeland, diaspora, academic, non-academic, Hindu and non-Hindu. The last category is not a single category, it's a billion categories. So if we're talking about the Hindus, it's like everyone has a different opinion on it. The Hindu, non-Hindu binary is the most problematic here, of course, a heuristic concept. We're here to discuss today on what's meant by the sympathetic study. And I think both Jane and David are going to talk extensively about it. One can also argue whether a particular study is sympathetic or not, or whether it even ought to be. Let me just focus on one issue here today. The reactions to the study of Hinduism by increasing number of Hindus in this country, and raise this question: can the sympathetic study of one's religion by others be demanded or requested by people within the tradition? Is this even an option? Examining the work on Hindu traditions written by scholars trained in Western universities has become a veritable cottage industry among Hindus today. Many Hindus in the diaspora are increasingly engaged in judging not just what is being written, but who is writing it and for what audience it's being written. To back up just a little, one can ask, is there such a concept as a sympathetic study of religion within the many Hindu traditions? Notwithstanding the very slippery nature of religion and the terms Hinduism and religion, we can say there are several ways in which Hindus have studied other traditions and their own. One is the more famous eclectic method, best exemplified by Gandhi and several others like him. Hindus of several persuasions have selectively studied and incorporated materials from other traditions into their worldview. And of course, it's been a fairly interesting and sympathetic study, but whether the result that you get from it is what was intended by others is open. Another is more similar to what we mean in the context today, but the aim again is different. I refer here to the theological debates in the many Vedanta commentaries. Here, before a theologian gave his, or in occasional cases, her viewpoint, the arguments and the beliefs of the opposing traditions had to be summarized as cogently and as succinctly as possible. It was a matter of justifiable pride to present the opposing viewpoints as accurately as possible. The Purva Paksha had to be really presented absolutely. In fact, when you read the commentary, sometimes you think the author is arguing that position. It's that convincing. Although the aim was ultimately to refute those positions, the Purva Paksha, the philosophical apparatus at least was studied with care and from many viewpoints. Careful study, even though one may not call it sympathetic in the current context of parts of religious traditions, is part of the Hindu commentarial tradition. The study of religion, as we loosely conceptualize, for the most part, is a Western enterprise and has its roots in multiple socio-political contexts. We all know that. For several generations, many such studies have been studies by European and American scholars have been part of Indian lore, part of the canon from which Hindus educated in Western academia got to know about their own traditions intellectually. This trajectory still continues. When Sri Vaishnava listservs were put together by young, computer-savvy students and older immigrants, a strange combination in 1994, some of the authoritative books in this list were those written by John Carman and Frank Clooney. Even now, the recommended books section among the in the Ramanuja.org website includes studies by Patricia Mummy, John Carman, and Frank. Frank's book, in fact, is written as outstanding in bold letters in that website. And it's it's run by a very, very conservative Sri Vaishnava theologian. This is sympathetic study at its best, without letting go of academic integrity, without compromising on intellectual rigor. These studies not just inform and educate audiences in Euro-American and Indo-American places, but with our global traffic, scholars both within, outside, and many of us was both within and outside many communities. To shift gears, not all stories have such happy outcomes. Actually, truth be told, even that story didn't have a fully happy outcome, but I'm not going there now. Some sections of the Indian diaspora in America have taken to reading these studies carefully, and these studies have become connected with issues of identity and self-representation here. There have been sharp reaction to certain kinds of studies, particularly those which utilize psychoanalysis or anthropology. But we can raise the question, can a sympathetic study of religion be demanded by people who claim to be part of that tradition? The adherents argue that they're not requesting sympathy or sympathetic studies, just continuing the fight against intellectual colonialism on the one hand, and asking to be treated on par with other religious studies on other religions on the other. To give a concrete example, in the high-profile California textbook case, and in many other fora as well, Hindus ask for what they consider to be equitable treatment. They frame this as a justice issue, not as a sympathetic portrayal by scholars. At issue is the perception that Islam, and it's always usually Islam that they refer to, and this is the reference point, is portrayed in the best and most positive light, the most sympathetic light, and Hinduism is not. This is the general argument. Now, actually, what I'd like to do for a minute here is to highlight how widespread this impression is among most Indians. Many academics I know think of this as a viewpoint of a few off-the-wall people, or that it's a sentiment that very few people have, and they're extremists, but it's not so. Even the most liberal Hindus in this country, many of them have that impression. Truth be told, that's the one that they have when they speak among themselves. It's not just a few people, extreme people, looking for a cause. The questions they frequently ask is, would they even talk about the Prophet that way? And that's the kind of question that's raised frequently. Untouchability, the teaching of untouchability to 6th grade kids, well, this and the whole slew of topics, if we have to do it, should we not kind of come up with similar issues with other religions? One of the problems, and there are many, of course, in this position, is that there are many positions within Hinduism. While some Hindus want to tone down the negative views of the caste system, many others want it in there. And this was part of the debate in the whole California system, the textbook system, because we had the debates over the textbooks serve as a focal point for showcasing dissensions within the community, highlighting caste and gender inequities within Hinduism itself. But in the debate that ensues, there was no attempt to succinctly and carefully summarize the opposing viewpoints like the Purva Paksha in intellectual ways, as the philosophical commentators did in the past, caricaturing, ridiculing, stereotyping, comparable to the worst of our own television commercials on elections next week, seems to dominate the landscape. Debates in general, and this is just my viewpoint, are good for the health of any community. Ideally, the internal and external critiques keep a tradition dynamic and sensitive to the inequities within the system. One can also say that there cannot be anymore any sharp divides between insiders and outsiders. So this is not like Hindus versus the rest of the world. There are many, many people in between here. And there's no such thing as an emic or an etic perspective in this free market of intellectual pursuits, transnational religions, and best practices environment. Our synagogues have Torah yoga, and Hindu temples have Sunday schools, Mother's Day, and graduation exercises. But what is missing from most of these contested debates is a sense of respect for an individual and for the individual, and the intellectual rigor in portraying the other, and above all, presenting the plurality of internal positions. In fact, one of the things that we have just begun to do, take a step as academics, is in terms of plurality of position, we've just started to look at tradition from the insider's viewpoint, not using the traditional phenomenology method, but from the categories which are significant to the own tradition. Seeing the dance this afternoon here was such an important step for me, because we're trying to understand the Hindu tradition the way Hindus have been transmitting the tradition for millennia, not simply to the Sanskrit text and a Tamil text. They're great. My business is reading those texts. But understanding Hinduism is to understand the performing arts, to understand the ritual, and to understand the tradition not simply through bibliocentric lenses, but from their viewpoint, from the inside viewpoint, their categories, is part of, or ought to be, a sympathetic study of religion. But I'll get off the bandwagon there. One could argue...
I want to be a sympathetic moderator, but could you give us a guesstimate about...
a minute?
Oh, that's excellent.
And you wouldn't deny a minute to a goddess, would you? Thank you. One could argue that people from particular ethnic groups and faith traditions, in some cases, can perhaps ask for a sympathetic study of their tradition, especially in cases where phenomena are being telescoped into textbooks, and that they can ask for a plurality of positions relevant to the audience to be presented, but demanding sympathetic portrayals because one is a minority in this country or in any country, and because it connects with issues of self-representation, would be like demanding love because one is needy. It becomes manipulative. On the other hand, to obsess about the inequities of some traditions and not others is not being fair to oneself or to the traditions involved. And to continue the study of religion, other traditions, from our positions of power, from theoretical positions which happen to be the flavor of the month for us in academia, without engaging in dialogue of internal categories and multiple positions, will lead us to rehearse the feud of all faiths and the blood of all battles. And this could be hazardous to one's emotional, physical, and spiritual health. Thank you.
I apologize. I saw that deep stack of pages, and I couldn't be sure that they were all blank. Thank you very much.
It's Maya.
David?
Thank you, George. Thank you, Vasudha, for those very astute remarks. Thanks to Don Swearer, wherever you are, for the invitation to join this panel. And thanks especially to John Carman and to Kit Dodgson for giving us the reason to be here to celebrate the history of the center. Congratulations. I'm very grateful to be part of this panel and to connect again with so many good friends. In fact, you all know, you're all professors as we are, how much fun it is to sit on a panel and scan the faces in the audience and to see all of the people for whom we feel such great friendship who are present. Krista, what a pleasure to see you here right at the front row. What a wonderful... And Ken Morgan. Could there be a center event without you? What a pleasure to have you here as well. And one could go on.
Don't.
But I won't.
I think we all believe you could.
Okay, good. Now, I'm sure that you know you have given us an almost impossible job. We're just a bunch of professors, and we're programmed for someone to press a button and have us talk for 45 minutes. To say something significant about the center in only 10 minutes may be beyond us, especially when it has meant so much to us, but we can try. And to help stay within the time limit, I have written out a few carefully calibrated remarks. You have my apologies in advance for having to read them. I would much rather speak them to you as if we were in a conversation. But if I spoke from notes, one story would lead to another, and it would take almost the rest of the hour. So let me begin. I understand that the title of this discussion, The Sympathetic Study of Religions, Peril and Promise, is meant to stand in for a whole host of issues that plague the study of religion, especially the awkward distinction, as Don mentioned in his introduction, between the so-called normative and descriptive approaches to religion. We work with that distinction in the American Academy of Religion each spring when we convene juries to make awards in 3 different areas: for constructive reflective studies in religion, analytical descriptive studies, and historical studies. We could start a fascinating discussion this afternoon about the shape of the field just by looking at some of the recent winners of the AAR Book Awards in these categories and asking how they construct the distinction between normative and descriptive approaches. This actually would make a good topic for a doctoral seminar. A perfect starting point for this investigation would be Bob Orsi's book, Between Heaven and Earth, the Religious Worlds People Make and the Scholars Who Study Them. This book was published by Princeton in 2004 and won the award for constructive reflective studies in religion in 2005. It might just as easily have been classified as an analytical descriptive study in religion. And it might very well, no predictions here, it might very well have won the prize in that category as well. The distinction between these categories is as complex as the field itself, and it changes in a heartbeat as different scholars explore the intellectual contours of their own branches of religious studies. Rather than lead you down the path into this tangled landscape, let me use my few precious moments, which are dwindling quickly, to make a few comments about the key word in the title of this panel. What does it mean for the study of religion to be sympathetic? I think that's where we're being led. John Carman and Kit Dodgson, and of course Ken Morgan as well, would know better than I, but I imagine that the word sympathetic had a fairly simple function in the deed of gift that established the center. As George read the longer text of the deed of gift, it seems that has become clear. When I listen for the nuances in the word, I hear it saying that we should study Buddhism or Islam or whatever tradition might catch our eye in order to appreciate it as a tradition in its own right, rather than to mock it or subject it to a missionary critique. As a founding ideal, this strikes me as being unobjectionable, even if it does set the center in opposition to certain kinds of theological agendas. If the term carries a hint of controversy today, perhaps it's because the old oppositional relationship, like the relationship, say, between Halloween and All Saints' Day, still remains in our consciousness when the reason for the opposition has long since disappeared. I think that the word sympathy gets much more interesting intellectually when it takes on a technical meaning in the hermeneutical tradition that we know as the phenomenology of religion. How could it not when we were so introduced to this tradition so well by John Carman when we were here at the center? As Ninian Smart once explained, the phenomenology of religion requires scholars to bracket their own theological presuppositions and explore others' worldviews with empathy and with imagination, words that we know are technical terms. Empathy has to do with feeling their way into other people's worlds, as Ninian Smart says, and imagination has to do with freely exploring the feelings and commitments of others. This week, we read the obituary of Clifford Geertz. He passed away on Monday. He was not a phenomenologist of religion in the narrow sense of the word, but I cannot think of a more skillful practitioner of this mode of interpretation. The Times Literary Supplement called Geertz's essays in the interpretation of cultures one of the 100 most important books since World War II. That would be a nice distinction. If you were going to list the 100 most important moments in the study of religion, you would have to include the time when Geertz and his wife were in Bali watching a cockfight, and they ran into a stranger's courtyard to escape the police. In a moment, Geertz says, they went from being non-persons to being members of the Balinese community. And out of this sympathetic bond grew his classic Notes on a Balinese Cockfight. You might say that the moment he threw himself into that courtyard and began to sit down for tea, he established that sympathetic bond that made it possible for him to study that community as deeply as he did. One of the most striking accounts of the combination between intellectual restraint and sympathetic understanding is still Vandeleu's picture of the scholar as a lover. Understanding, in fact, presupposes intellectual restraint, but this is never the attitude of the cold-blooded spectator. It is, on the contrary, the loving gaze of the lover on the beloved object. For all understanding rests on self-surrendering love. Were this not the case, then not only all discussion of what appears in religion, but all discussion of appearance in general would be quite impossible, since to him who does not love, nothing whatever is manifested. I think it's odd to think of scholars as lovers for all sorts of reasons. But something like this seems to be essential when you are introducing undergraduates to the study of religion. With all the skepticism, fear, and sheer indifference toward religion in our culture, I think it's crucial that students understand how someone can actually love religion. And you cannot awaken that feeling of love unless you bring it with you into the classroom. You might argue, that this feeling of love has a place in the classroom with a group of 18-year-olds. But it would seem to be a bit quaint in a research seminar in the study of religion. My only response to this argument would be to look at some of the works that speak most vividly about the virtues of our field. Since I work in Buddhism, one in particular comes to mind. A few years ago, Gananath Obeyasekara wrote an essay on religious violence in Sri Lanka for an issue of Daedalus on religion and politics. Lamin had an article in the same, very fine article in the same issue. Even though the situation in Sri Lanka has changed, this essay is as pertinent and as chilling today as it was the day it was written. It is a work of exquisite, condensed historical scholarship and empathic imagination. In just a few pages, Obeyasekara takes the reader inside the fractured landscape of a modern Buddhist conscience and shows how Buddhists in Sri Lanka accommodated themselves to a murderous wave of ethnic violence. Here, sympathy is bound together with a fierce, critical intelligence. It is precisely because Obeyasekara can feel himself inside this religious situation that it fills him with horror. The title of our panel is certainly right when it suggests that there is peril in this kind of sympathy, just as there is peril in religion itself. But I never heard anyone tell us here in the center that understanding religion would be painless or easy. Wilfred Cantwell Smith made that very clear to us. I am just grateful that we still have the Center for the Study of World Religions to help us negotiate these perils. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's a little hard to make the call between Lamin and Jane, but we take we're going to have Lamin first because Jane, we all know, is the youngest of the traditions that are being focused on.
That's correct.
I should get my mic in front of me. Thank you very much. It's probably providential that I should precede Jane because I arrived here at the center at Harvard in 1981 thanks to Jane. She was the reason, really, why I came here. I had met her previously different conferences around the world. And she became, in so many ways, not only for me but for my family, what in Islam, in Arabic, would call my wajib al-wujud, the reason for my being, as it were. Thank you, Jane. Mutashakkar. When I arrived at the center, Wilfred's shadow still loomed large. John was the director. Wilfred was around. I had read Wilfred Cantwell Smith's wonderful study of Islam in modern history when I was an undergraduate and a history major. And history became, for me, the way into religion. My professor of religious studies in college from Chicago, we used to call him Old Pa Johnson, used to ride his bicycle around campus in upstate New York. He also taught Latin in college. But the religion that most interested him was really religion as a relic. So he would look at Zoroastrian, extinct Zoroastrian practices. And I thought, well, I want to learn a lot about religion. I don't think the Department of Religious Studies is going to help me. And fortunately, I had a marvelous history professor who did his PhD here at Harvard in European history, and then went to Columbia and studied under Ted Dabari, the great classical traditions of the East, Buddhism, Hinduism. And that was very fortunate for me because he really opened up the field of religion in a historical way with great sympathy but great rigorous standard of scholarship. And in some ways, Wilfred was the embodiment of that. I used to say to Wilfred, well, I really don't think I should sit on some of these committees here at Harvard. I said, I'm not a specialist in New Testament. I'm not really technically a theologian. I'm not a church historian. Wilfred would say, but anyone who teaches in the field of religion has a stake in the study of religion. He used to insist on that. And I think one of the things that one is grateful for at the center is to demonstrate, to embody, if you like, this rigorous scholarship in religion, in the study of religion, along with a sympathetic appreciation of it. One evening, I had invited Kenneth Cragg to Harvard, and Wilfred very kindly agreed to host him in Arlington. So I drove Kenneth Cragg to Arlington, and one evening we had dinner there, and he and Wilfred got into a very interesting discussion about how you approach Christian theology and Islam. What was so interesting was how the two of them really converged on the sympathetic study of religion. In other words, rigorous study of religion should be accountable, and should be accountable to a community of faith or communities of faith. And I think that was surprising for both of them. I remember that evening, Wilfred saying yes, yes, and Kenneth saying yes, yes. And there was a kind of discovery about this. They didn't know that they would be saying yes, yes to each other so much. Kenneth Cragg is still around, by the way. He wrote 2 books after 9/11, reflecting on Islam in the light of 9/11. One called "Am I Not Your Lord?" is a verse from the Quran, "Alastu bi Rabbikum." And the second one is called "The Quran and the West." Unfortunately, for Kenneth Cragg, his great learning and scholarship gets a little lost in the arcane business of language. I think, and I'll tell him this, I've told him this many times, that Kenneth tries to write prose like poetry, and the two don't mesh easily, the genre. But so Wilfred's legacy, I really didn't realize his impact on me was so deep and so profound. In the study of religion, for me as an historian, it is clearly important to relate religion to the communities of faith. In August this year, I was approached by the Times Literary Supplement in London, who were publishing a special edition of the TLS called New Ways in History. And this edition is a 40-year anniversary edition called New Ways in History. In 1966, the TLS published 5 major essays on the writing of history, new ways of doing history, which had an enormous impact on historiography. And then in 2006, 40 years later, they returned to the subject. When the editor asked me to write a piece, he said, do you know, in 1966, no one mentioned religion as a subject for the study of history. Would you please write an article for us? And I thought, what am I supposed to say? That you didn't in 1966 have anything to say about religion. And the others had an advantage because there had been essays in their field of history, whereas in mine there was really very little. Anyway, I did write a piece for them. They call it Religion's Return, which is a kind of global survey and the challenge to historiography. It seems to me that, at least speaking to my colleagues in the secular departments, that the old days when religion can be ignored as not worth taking seriously are gone. Religion is a major force shaping the history of the contemporary world for good and ill. And I think that the center's methodology of rigorous scholarship combined with sympathetic study would serve us well. I've been also commissioned by Oxford University Press to undertake a very ambitious project called Series in the Study of World Christianity in 9 volumes. And I'm not going to be writing all the volumes. I'm only writing 1 volume, the introductory volume. But when we were setting up the volumes and the titles for it, one of my old professors in London, Richard Gray, who's now died, insisted that there should be a volume on Eastern Orthodoxy, so that the history of Christianity takes in the Oriental, the Eastern part of the canvas. And that I think is very, very wise. And one of the other things in the volume is actually a volume on iconography and aesthetics, so that religion is not only studied and analyzed, but it is performed and acted out. A third project that is just getting undergoing is I came across a document, a book actually, by a very interesting Muslim scholar who belongs to a tradition of Islamic pacifism. That's to say, repudiation of jihad, of violence in the spread of religion, and also political neutrality. They will not accept, this community will not accept political office for themselves. He wrote a book called Kitab al-Bushra, Sharh Mirkat al-Kubra, and published in Tunis a long time ago. And when I looked at this material, it offered the first intellectual defense of pacifism in Islam. And its sort of center, which Bill Graham would be familiar with, and Jane as well, is really this notion which is very strong in the hadith sciences called Ilm al-Rijal, which is science of the study of the men and women who transmit the traditions. So that knowledge itself, which is transmitted, is actually embodied in personalities, in people whose character you can actually track and trace. And this work, I think, deserves to be better known, but more on that anon. The other thing I'd like to say about this rigorous scholarship and sympathetic study of religion, is that I'm trained as an historian. And I think one of the most fascinating things about the study of history is the comparative. That is the study not only of one culture or civilization, but the interaction, the interface between cultures and civilizations. And for me, one of the most stunning examples of that kind of material is actually a Muslim Chinese in the 15th century who led the maritime expansion of the Ming dynasty and wrote a book which is a fascinating account looking at cultures. He traveled maybe 70,000 miles by sea, and his observations of the cultures of the world in different parts of the world is quite astonishing. And I think if you compare the intellectual caliber of that work with, say, Marco Polo, which sometimes get fanciful, contrived and fabricated, I think you'll be astonished at this. And so that strengthened my conviction that the study of religion can actually be a wonderful way into the study of the encounter of cultures and civilizations. Mahe took very great care not to distort the cultures and the traditions of others. He recorded this very, very carefully. And this is certainly true with Al-Biruni, already in the 11th century, and his 2-volume study of India, very rigorous intellectual study of India, Sanskrit philosophy, compared to Greek philosophy, and his own Islamic reflections on this. So it seems to me that the center stands for a tradition that is absolutely crucial to the exposition of religion and the representation of religious phenomena and symbols. And that it is for that reason, my final anecdote, that in the TLS piece, I looked at what is happening on the scene in China since really the collapse of the Cultural Revolution, 1976. And it's quite astonishing. I arrived in Shanghai in a taxi from the airport going to Fudan University. My fellow traveler was a rabbi from California. And in the taxi were 2 Chinese scholars. And all the way from the airport to Fudan, they were recounting about how they were translating the major Jewish philosophical and theological books into Chinese. And my rabbi friend was just open. He couldn't believe this. That these young Chinese scholars knew far more about Jewish philosophy and Jewish theology than he did as a rabbi in California. And it seems to me that religion is a marvelous way to explore and to broaden the sort of horizons of people, especially in our day and age. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamin. Jane.
Good afternoon. What a pleasure it is to be here looking at old friends, colleagues, faculty members. Thank you very much for inviting me back to this room where I believe I have not spoken for quite a number of years. I looked at the assignment for today as Don gave it to us, and he suggested that we consider such things as how to integrate more seamlessly multiplex expressions, paradigms of world religion studies and Christian studies, normative, historical, descriptive, theoretical approaches. And I took a deep breath and I thought, no, I think maybe I will just focus on what we mean by sympathetic, or rather what I mean by sympathetic and what it has meant to me as a former student and faculty member at the Center for the Study of World Religions, and also to consider the small phrase that he put out sort of at the end of all of this wonderful theoretical possibility, and that is to reflect a little bit on the practice and study of religion. The practice and study of religion. Now, the nice thing about going last in a panel is that you can say some outrageous things and people probably aren't listening anymore anyway. So one thing I will suggest is that perhaps among the many possibilities for understanding sympathetic might be congenial, kindred in spirit, those qualities that those of us who were at the center experienced so much in the leadership of John Carman and Wilfred Smith before him, hospitable to us as students, hospitable to the visitors who came, hospitable to the very religions that we were studying. And for many of us, that was a new and rather wonderful concept that has stayed with us over the years. I haven't read every word of this community and colloquy, but I've looked at the pictures, and I have found some really fascinating ones on page 116. We have George Rupp looking a bit quizzically at the Dalai Lama. One can imagine what George might have been thinking. On page 52, we have John Carman and Lamin to my left, looking all decked out for commencement. A couple of years back, that was. But I think my favorite picture is the one on page 60, showing a greatly smiling John and Enocha Carman, hospitable in the way that they showed us the true meaning of that word, those of us who were at the center. So, John, congratulations to you not only on the fine book that you and Kit have put out, but on the model that you provided for us as we have proceeded to go about the study of religion in what we hope is a hospitable way. So sympathetic, as John and Enocha personified this for us, applies really to human relationships in the study of religion, living and talking together, eating together, studying together, learning together, putting theologies and methodologies and cultures and traditions into a kind of big shaker and pouring out lived religion and personal ways of sharing. That was what the center meant to us. To me, that is the meaning of the sympathetic practice and study of religion. And I have to just say that I have been here for the last couple of days as a member of the visiting committee, and I am delighted and happy to say so to both Bill and Don that it seems to me that the center is recapturing that sense of hospitality and congeniality that so characterized it in the days in which we all were part of that center, and for that I'm very grateful. Let me also suggest another dimension of sympathetic. This might be even more outrageous, but it's one that hasn't been brought up here. And that is a kind of relationship or integratedness, if you will, of disciplines. And my point is, and I think we all understand this very well, that the study of religion really can't be carried out without taking advantage of, understanding, using the methodologies, the information of other academic disciplines. You all at Harvard have the wonderful opportunity of having these tremendous resources that you can use in your understanding of religion, politics, history, social relationships, psychology, health, economics, and many other disciplines. And what the center can uniquely provide is the religion piece. How religion fits in with all of these and how you cannot understand religion as an isolated phenomenon. I suppose that's what Don was suggesting when he talked about seamlessly integrating the work of the center into the work of the university. And certainly the resources are here in a way that I hardly can think of in any other place in the world. So I congratulate you on that opportunity and ask again that the center take leadership in making sure that the study of religion becomes as essential to those other disciplines as they are essential to the study of religion. Now, it's been maybe 20 years or so since I left Harvard, and I have tried to bring some of this sensitivity to these two dimensions of sympathetic, both in terms of personal relationships in the study of religion and in the integrity of the disciplines working together. Most recently, as has been said, I am teaching and working in Christian-Muslim relationships at Hartford Seminary, a very little institution down the road a bit, but one that does some really rather amazing things. And we have a growing number of students at Hartford Seminary who come from areas of the world in which it's not always so easy to be sympathetic. Some of the same kinds of ways that David was referring to. Situations where people are killed for being members of one religious tradition or another. And so they're coming to Hartford Seminary to understand how they can contribute to the circumstances in which they live, how they can promote this sense of sympathy and appreciation in areas in which tensions are enormously high. So I'd like just very briefly in the time that I have to share with you 3 or 4 examples of the kinds of students we have, trying to show both the importance, if it can be done, of a sympathetic appreciation of the religion of the other, but also this sense of integratedness of the disciplines and how important it is to understand religion with the assistance of some of these other kinds of information. For example, we have now 2 young Christian students from Indonesia, a man and a woman. And the young man, not too long ago, spent several months in the garbage dumps of Jakarta to find out what being absolutely, desolately poor has to say about Christian-Muslim relationships. And so he's come to Hartford Seminary to use our resources and some of the other resources in the greater Hartford area to understand the relationship of religion and economy. We have a bishop from Nigeria. Lamin will know more about this than I do, and I learned more than I knew before by a conversation with your faculty member, Jacob Olupona, last night. He's living in an area in which increasing numbers of political units are adopting Sharia or Islamic law. To his surprise, what he has found out is that that is not leading actually to more tensions between the religions, but it's leading to some efforts on the part of the Muslim leadership to reach out to the Christian community and say, how can we together have more appreciation for each other and learn to live together? So John is here to study Christian-Muslim relationship, but from the dimension of law. And what is the relationship of law and religion? We have a number of young women Turkish students who, oddly enough, come from their Muslim home country, Turkey, to study Islam at a Christian seminary, Hartford Seminary, and the reason, of course, is that they can wear Islamic dress when they do it. at Hartford Seminary, and they cannot at home. So they're here trying to struggle with the relationship between religion and politics, and particularly in this very interesting time in which Turkey and Western Europe are doing a delicate dance trying to figure out if religion, in fact, has anything to do with whether or not Turkey may become a member of the European Union. And finally, we have a very interesting young woman who's been in business for many years from Singapore, and she is now back working on her master's thesis in Singapore on Christian-Muslim relations and discovering that far more important in this equation than her being a Christian is the fact that she's Chinese. So she is looking at the study of religion in terms of questions of race and ethnicity. The integratedness of this range, this variety of disciplines, which I think I'm correct in saying is what Bill was talking about this morning in terms of corollary disciplines and reflecting on how we do our work as one body of scholars. And wouldn't it be wonderful if the center could really provide the leadership for the university in doing that kind of work? So let me conclude by saying I think we at Hartford Seminary have two challenges, and I would put those out as perhaps the challenges that the Center for the Study of World Religions also has. The first one is one dimension of a reality in which economics, politics, troublesome histories, racial ethnic identities, and many other factors are inseparable determinants. And the second, how to foster an atmosphere of the sympathetic study of religion, not only for those who remain in the world of academia, but for those who return to regions and cultures in which understanding the various dimensions of another religion appreciatively may be intimately involved with the preservation of human life. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you all four. You've been very patient. Ordinarily, I would think it would be very helpful to have some interaction among panel members, since there are many points individual ones of you raised that invite commentary from others. But I think we'll move past that so that our patient hearers have a chance to put at least a few questions before we have to break up. So open the floor for questions. Yes?
There is so much emphasis in the media currently, internationally, I think, about the relationship between Islam and violence, that I am absolutely stunned and fascinated to hear Lamin's reference to a pacifist tradition in Islam. I would be grateful for if he could say, if he and anyone else on the panel could say some more words about this, and hopefully this fact might get out into the media and improve the current disastrous situation.
Lamin, you want to start, and then Jane?
Yes, I was myself incredulous when I first encountered this tradition of pacifism in Islam. After all, any student of classical Islam would know about the Futuh, or the Futuhat, Kitab Futuh al-Buldan, which is a book, 2-volume account of the conquests in the early centuries of Islam. So when I encountered this tradition, at first somewhat incredulous, I began to see how an alternative reading of the tradition was available to these clerics. After all, these clerics, one must remember, are scholars by profession. This is how they earn their living, by teaching and writing and circulating materials, and so forth and so on. And I think, however strange or unusual it may sound, there is no doubt in my mind that this is a viable tradition with a 700-year history behind it. And when they encountered the French, for example, who took action against them because the French suspected them of hiding their intentions, they said to the French, we plead our innocence because, look, among us there are troublemakers. There are people who are for violence, for example. We have resisted them. We've opposed them. And we've paid a price long before you came. And so the tradition, it seems to me, is a viable one. And what we need to do is to sort of learn from these people about how they have demonstrated the viability of Islam in peaceful conditions. And I think it's a tradition talking about hospitality and sympathy. There are remarkable people known for their hospitality. That's really almost like a second name to them. Extraordinarily hospitable, extraordinarily sympathetic, and with a wonderful skill at community building. And hopefully more of this tradition will be better known with time.
As we move on to another question, I'd just like to observe that the question, there's a general point, I think, of great interest behind your question, and it was initially stated by Vasudha, namely that any rigorous and sympathetic understanding of religion has to recognize the plurality within any tradition. And this is a nice example of radical plurality within Islam. But I'll not belabor this, but at least for all of us to think about, the plurality within a tradition also greatly complexifies the notion of sympathetic study of religion. If we just look within a tradition, the least sympathy is probably evident among those who are quarreling over the right to use the name of the tradition, that is, the internal disagreements within them. It may be that it's easier for outsiders to be sympathetic once one is aware of the tremendous variety within a tradition, but it's not so easy for insiders. In fact, as there are ample cases all around the world, they're quite aggressively hostile rather than sympathetic to the differences within a single tradition. You had a question, yes?
Yes, I'd like to say something more about the relationship between sympathy and criticism. David Eckel produces. And I asked this thinking about the contributions of feminist scholars, often speaking from within the faith about that faith, engaging in hermeneutics of recovery and suspicion. And so I'm wondering, as scholars committed to this sympathetic approach to the study of religion, where do you see the place for criticism? What's the relationship between sympathy and criticism?
Well, you're right. That's an issue that came up in really all of your presentations. She threw the ball to you first, David, so why don't you start?
Thank you, Professor Mrozek, for that nice question. The point that I was trying to make in my talk was that sympathy doesn't necessarily have to be equated with approval. That you through a sympathetic engagement with a tradition, feeling your way, as it were, and I think also thinking your way. I think there's a cognitive dimension to sympathy as well as an emotional one. You can enter into a religious situation, a series of practices, a series of feelings, whatever they might be, that are horrifying. And growing out of that would come an instinctive critical response. And it would be appropriate in that kind of setting to, what would be the right word to use, as it were, to signal it. You know, you don't write polemics in this way, but I think in the case of Obeyesekera's article, which I'm sure you know well, it's hard to come away from that article feeling anything but a sense of deep dismay and concern that grows out of his ability to enter into a tradition that is in many respects quite dismaying.
Other comments on that, or should we just allow more questions?
Well, I just make one comment on that. Al-Biruni, who was an 11th century Muslim scientist and did this incredible study of Indian religion and customs, was obviously offended by some of the customs he observed. One particular, which surprised me, one particular one is the custom of levitation. He commented on that. He seemed to be offended by that. And yet, al-Biruni never lost his respect for Indian religions. It's quite remarkable. If you compare, say, al-Biruni with any of his contemporary Western observers of other cultures and other civilizations, he took it seriously. He quarreled with it, but he never disparaged it. He never sort of looked down on it. And I think that, for me, is an example of how one can have a critical approach to the religious phenomenon while being sympathetic or respectful at the same time. I say to my students at the beginning of my course on Christian-Muslim dialogue, thou shalt not bear false witness. And that means that if you agree with somebody, you take liberties with them. I do. But if you disagree with somebody, then it's incumbent upon you not to misrepresent them. For me, that's absolute first rule of scholarship.
Yes.
Throughout the world, students learn languages, science, mathematics, history, art, music. Should there be courses in the people who, religious and non-religious people of the world? Should there be a course on religion throughout the world? Studying not one religion, but study the people who practice religion and the people who don't practice religion throughout the world.
I don't think you have a completely neutral series of respondents here on that question, but I invite anyone
Who wants to state the obvious here? There certainly are in my university. I think it's essential, but I'm sure that everyone would agree.
Well, the question is, would you want to require it as a course of all students? That's not quite what you asked, but that's putting it a little more sharply.
I prefer situations where it's an option that's strongly encouraged. You're an administrator. You know how to do that, George.
Okay, there's been a question in the back there, and then Krista.
This man in the far back has been waving his hand.
Oh, well, okay. Yes. Yep.
I wanted to follow up, George, on your point in relation to Vasu's talk. And, Vasu's saying that the sympathetic study means that we study, to cite Wilfred, the study of persons. I always tell my students that Wilfred was terrible at grammar and had great methodological insight in that sentence. And that you validate all the perspectives in a tradition, the plurality of positions within a tradition. Yet, how do you deal with the current discourse in which the people who most vociferously are complaining about the academic study of religion do not want that plurality, do not want it to be about persons, but want it to be about some kind of reified ideology? And so, someone is repeating George's question. When one of the perspectives you want to study precisely says that multiple perspectives are wrong.
That's sort of the same question as how does an institution proclaim itself to be open when it's not open to those who aren't open?
Right.
As a scholar, it seems to me not all that difficult. You simply study the person who takes that position.
Yeah.
They don't want to be studied that way.
Well, but at this point, there's not a complete control by the persons being studied as to how they should be approached, as long as it's on the same basis as all others. I think we could circle that question for quite a while. Maybe we better let a couple of other people in. Jane said you've been very eagerly trying to get in. So,
in terms of objective, sympathetic, it seems to me you need both perspectives. But I find it best to do this in some kind of a framework that gives a basis for comparison, particularly between other faiths. And I think this is especially important now with the conflict between the West and Islam, or some aspects of Islam. I'm trying to show how this can be done with my book, the complex one and the simple one, to show how the different theological points of view found in the Bible and the Quran colors the perspective of both faiths and how they can be understood and how they can be compared in basis, hopefully, for some kind of dialogue.
Well, maybe we can see if that book also can be available in the Harvard Divinity bookstore. I guess I'd just observe that the frameworks are tricky and almost certainly have built into them one set of assumptions or another. Even our deed of gift, which seemed quite successful in keeping at bay its own presuppositions until it got to the very end and talked about the varying religions have been will be revealed as part of an ascending cycle. And I think almost any framework we have will itself have to be subjected to criticism.
Well, but I think it's something we need to discuss.
Well, I think that would be great, and I hope you'll make your book available in the bookstore so everybody can get to it. Krister?
I just had a footnote to the question of teaching religion as a required element in college education. And I think I picked up that a preliminary report of the big study of the curriculum at Harvard, undergrad, has religion as one of the factors that they speak about in a required form as necessary for citizenship in the world. And it's up there for all discussion.
It'll be very interesting to see when the revised curriculum comes out if the category of religion is still in one of those areas of requirements. Any comments about that? Yes.
The panelists have talked about how religion needs to involve other disciplines in different ways, and I think the general agreement is that religion as such is not a discipline. So my question really is, what do you think religion is bringing to the table when there's an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary discussion? I would throw out a thought, which is that the discussion ends up being about priorities. Is your priority compassion or freedom or justice or whatever, rather than do you have a God or not have a God?
So, Peter, most questions are.
If you understood that from what I said, that it was not my intention. It was to say that to study religion is of necessity to draw from a variety of other disciplines, because religion in itself is perhaps can't be understood without those supporting factors that are examined by other units in a university. But I don't believe that is to say that there's no such thing as a study of religion.
I didn't say the study of religion. What is the discipline? What is that you wish that religion would bring to all those disciplines as much interest in religion as we have in them? So the question is, what is it that we're bringing?
I could try to answer the question, but I'm assuming that we would be bringing an understanding of human beings in relationship to either the divine or a larger worldview or issues of eternality and so forth, or one could bring to it particular ethics related to various disciplines. I mean, you can go on and on.
Yes.
I wanted to highlight another aspect of sympathy, the kind of pathos. One of the things that I experienced as a student in the Center for World Religions was the pathos of trying to be a believer in a particular tradition. And not only my own pathos, but also that of others, my fellow students. And the struggle to be loyal to a tradition and yet to see all of its warts, difficulties, and challenges, not only in some kind of essential way, but ongoing. And so the pathos that religion opens us to. And I guess I'd like to highlight a remark again of Wilfrid's, that he said, well, there aren't very many Petra Passionists anymore, but I'm one of them. And that is to say that the pathos of being a believer opens us to a wider pathos that I think is part of the study of religion.
Interesting.
Yes.
I wonder whether it's possible for us to come up with a definition or redefinition of sympathetic approach that avoids putting things in dichotomy. Like sympathy means not being critical, or sympathy means not being objective. Those kind of being critical, being objective, and being sympathy are not on two sides of the fence. If we could come up with a definition of sympathy that could be less dichotomous. The reason why I'm saying that is that I follow up Jane Smith's question of interdisciplinary dialogue. That if we are going to involve the study of religion, going to include other disciplines. For instance, if we include sociology or psychology, whatever, or politics, some disciplines might say what I do is they do not have what I do is they might be critical, but I think the critical piece is not necessarily not a contribution. In other words, could we understand the sympathetic approach as like an open-minded, like towards an understanding of the believer? And if you want to truly understand the believer, you have to take multiple approaches and multiple disciplines to get a better understanding of the believer. So, especially the religion itself is diverse. The insider, him or herself, can be critical of the tradition. So.
Well, first of all, we've talked about criticism, but I think to suggest that criticism is always negative is not to take into understanding the full range of what to be critical means, is to reflect on. But secondly, I don't think any of us would want to support the sorts of dichotomies that you are arguing against. We would be in agreement with you that those dichotomies don't fit within, and almost definitionally don't fit within, an understanding of what it means to approach sympathetically.
That does not have the dichotomy in it. That's what I'm saying.
My personal feeling is that definitions are always problematic because something is always left out, and in the kinds of understandings that we've tried to offer today, in a sense, perhaps I can say their beauty is that there is a certain open-endedness in the appreciation that has been suggested.
I think what I'm for outside, for instance, for a psychologist who is doing objective, so-called study of religion, if you have a definition of sympathy so inclusive, you could say a psychologist studies also sympathetic. That's what you could be inclusive to the extent that a different approach can be also sympathetic, even though it's not sympathetic just the way you have to be identified with the insider. That's what I'm saying.
I think that's okay.
Okay, I think there's no disagreement. Everyone would like to have an understanding of sympathetic that is not over against critical or rigorous. I see Don standing there, and my watch tells me it is time, so I want to thank all of you very much for your patience and invite you again, please, to come across the street for the reception there. Don, do you have more comments?
I also want to just reiterate that invitation, and I also want to mention the names of two people who have been very, very important in terms of the founding and the history of the center who were here that David Eckel also mentioned, and I would simply like to repeat their names. Kenneth Morgan, who, in terms of the funding for the center, probably the center would not be here if it were not for Ken. And then also Krister Stendahl, who has been historically so important in terms of the support of the center. So I hope, one, you will indeed follow us over to the center and join me in giving both Ken and Krister a hand of appreciation, and also for the panelists.